Hey guys, tonight we're gonna quietly drift back into history, into a world of subtle rules, hidden courtesies, and the quiet desperation of lives lived in the shadows of wealth and expectation. Somewhere in the middle of London, in a house warmed by the soft flicker of gas lamps and the gentle scent of flowers forced to bloom out of season, one young woman moved with a practiced grace, navigating a world that was as much about appearances as it was about survival. Her name was Eliza. She chose him, not a prince, not a wealthy lord, but the quiet certainty of a brothel worker who could see her as more than a title or a coin. His presence was unassuming, almost ordinary, though there was a steadiness to him that spoke of endurance rather than excitement. He did not promise grandeur, he promised calm. And for a girl like Eliza, whose life had been filled with the unpredictable cruelty of fortune and family, calm was not nothing. It was a kind of luxury. The evening began in the usual way. The streets outside were slick from an earlier rain, the occasional clatter of carriage wheels a soft accompaniment to the distant chiming of church bells. Inside, the house moved with its own rhythm. Girls in muted silk dresses adjusted their hair and whispered polite words to one another while the house mistress oversaw the arrival of clients. The air was a mixture of warmth, perfume, and the faint tang of iron from the candle stands. It was a scent that became familiar and comforting after weeks of repetition, a small constancy in an otherwise uncertain world. Eliza had learned to move quietly through this space, her feet aware of every creak in the wooden floors, her posture maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. She could sense who had arrived before she saw them, the weight of a presence in the hallway, the soft cough, the shuffle of boots on the mat, and then she saw him. He waited in the parlor, seated with an almost exaggerated patience. Not a nobleman, no elaborate rings or chains gleaming in the gaslight. His clothes were clean, well mended, modest in color, and cut, suggesting neither wealth nor pretension. Just a quiet dignity, the kind that came from knowing one's place in the world and not resenting it. "Good evening," he said, rising with the faintest bow as Eliza approached. His voice was calm, neither deep nor particularly commanding, just present in the room like a soft exhalation. "Good evening, sir," she replied, curtsying with that practiced precision that signaled both politeness and availability, a gesture repeated hundreds of times, now natural like a second skin. They began with light conversation, the type that warmed the room without requiring exertion. The weather, the city streets, a recent theatrical performance topic safe enough to engage without crossing boundaries. He listened with genuine interest, nodding occasionally, eyes steady but not intrusive. Eliza noted the way he seemed to take up space without demanding it, a subtle distinction she had learned to recognize early in her time here. The conversation moved forward, slowly, like a stream that had nowhere urgent to go. She poured him a small glass of claret, her fingers brushing his hand ever so slightly, a gesture almost invisible but meaningful in its deliberate subtlety. He did not recoil. Instead, he gave a brief smile, one that acknowledged the intimacy without overt declaration. This was a man accustomed to the soft rhythms of human interaction, a man who did not need to assert dominance to feel complete. As the evening wore on, the transition from conversation to touch was gentle, measured, almost imperceptible. Eliza was aware of the narrative she enacted, the charming companion, the attentive listener, the quiet pleasure giver. But in his presence, the script felt lighter, almost optional. He did not demand dramatics, did not insist on grandiose gestures. Instead, he offered a steady hand, a patient ear, a presence that allowed her to relax without guilt or fear. When the act itself concluded, he did not withdraw immediately. There was a pause, a quiet lingering of warmth and shared air, as though the world outside had softened and condensed into that small, dimly lit room. "You are remarkably composed," he said softly, a statement that was neither compliment nor judgment, but simple observation. "Thank you," she replied, a minimal response, though internally she acknowledged the accuracy. She had to be composed. It was survival, elegance, and protection rolled into one. She had learned early that charm was currency, but calm was security. And he seemed to recognize that instinctively. He dressed methodically, unhurried, returning coins with a nod rather than a flourish. Every movement was deliberate, economical, respectful. And when he finally departed, it was without fanfare, leaving behind only the echo of his quiet presence. Eliza moved then to the small, private room she shared with two other girls. The blue silk dress she had worn for the evening was carefully removed, corset undone, hair released from its pins. The familiar rituals of washing and preparation were soothing, grounding. The world outside, the demands, the expectations, the performance receded with each motion. She breathed deeply, luxuriating in the ordinary domestic comfort that existed solely for her and her companions. The others were there, quietly attending to their own postures, small conversations floating over tea and modest snacks. They spoke of nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just observations of the night's arrivals, minor grievances, small triumphs. Eliza listened, occasionally contributing, but mostly letting the sound of domestic normalcy anchor her. In this small kitchen, among her peers, she was merely herself, not an actor, in a carefully orchestrated evening. The night extended, measured by the distant rain and the steady ticking of the clock. Eventually, the house settled into quiet, the late arrivals delayed or diverted by weather, leaving only the lingering warmth of the fires and the soft murmur of occasional conversation. Eliza lay in her modest bed, the cotton sheets cool, the mattress yielding under the weight of her body. Sleep began its slow descent, wrapping her in its steady embrace. She thought of him briefly, not in longing nor in dramatic desire, but as a presence that had gently affirmed her existence beyond the roles she was compelled to play. It was a rare acknowledgement, the kind that left a small warmth in her chest, enough to carry her gently into unconsciousness. Outside, the storm persisted, rain tapping against the window panes, wind sighing through the streets. Inside, the house remained the sanctuary of subtle order, the quiet choreography of domestic and professional life, continuing in muted echoes. The girls slept, the lamps flickered and dimmed, and Eliza sank further into the restful rhythm of body and mind. And in those moments before dreams, she thought of choices, not of fortune or social ascent, not of grandeur or extravagance, but of the small, quiet decisions that shaped her life, the moments where her presence and perception were acknowledged without calculation. And somehow, that knowledge, simple and unassuming, carried her further than wealth ever could. The hours passed gently, without incident or fanfare. Her body rested, her mind wandered softly through memory and thought, and the world outside continued on, indifferent yet persistent. The life she inhabited was complicated, constrained by circumstance and expectation, but in the quiet intimacy of personal choice, in the acknowledgement of her own agency, there was a small, enduring comfort. Eliza's thoughts drifted toward the morning, to the soft routines that awaited her, the washing, the dressing, the careful negotiation of appearances and attention, but they did not intrude upon the calm. The night belonged to sleep, to the slow restoration of muscles and mind. And in that suspension, she rested fully, the ordinary miracle of bodily renewal proceeding without interruption, a subtle counterpoint to the chaotic, intricate arrangements that defined her waking hours. It was not a grand existence, nor one likely to be recorded in history books, but it was real, and for now, that was enough. The storm outside softened into a steady murmur, a gentle accompaniment to the quiet symphony of breath, heartbeat, and occasional sigh of contentment that filled the room. Eliza remained in that space between wakefulness and sleep, where the mind begins to loosen its grip on conscious control, when narrative and memory dissolve into sensation and the body assumes its natural rhythm. There was comfort in repetition, in the known, in the carefully maintained boundaries that allowed her to navigate the unpredictable landscape of her profession without surrendering herself entirely. And so the night carried on, soft and unremarkable in its endurance, marking the passage of hours with gentle persistence. She slept, untroubled and safe, within the walls that had seen many nights like this, the world beyond fading to the periphery, leaving only warmth, quiet, and the faint, enduring imprint of choice in a life constrained by circumstance. Morning, when it arrived, would bring its own obligations, its careful choreography of movement and attention, its delicate balancing of appearance and interaction. But for now, the night held her gently, a lullaby written not by melody or verse, but by the quiet constancy of survival, agency, and the rare, understated acknowledgement of being seen for who she was, not merely for the role she was expected to play. And as she drifted further, the awareness of that simple truth settled softly, a gentle anchor in a world otherwise dictated by expectation, convention, and the quiet tyranny of social hierarchy, a hierarchy that she navigated with calm precision, learning in small increments the art of existing without losing herself entirely, the subtle mastery of patience and observation, the small victories found in ordinary endurance, the unremarkable, yet her sleep was slow, measured, almost ceremonial in its regularity. When she stirred, it was not with urgency, but with a gradual acknowledgement of the new day. Light seeped through the curtained window, a pale gray illumination that neither demanded attention nor offered warmth. The house had already begun its low hum of activity, footsteps in distant corridors, the clinking of utensils, muted voices exchanged over breakfast that were more ritual than nourishment. Eliza rose carefully, allowing her body to stretch with deliberate slowness. The routines of her morning were familiar, comforting in their predictability. Dressing, washing, adjusting her hair, each movement a small reassurance that the day could be managed. The other girls were present, of course, and their conversations drifted in soft, undemanding tones, touching on trivialities. The arrival of a new fabric for dresses, the sudden disappearance of a hairpin, the subtle irritation of a client who had misunderstood instructions. She moved among them without urgency, her presence neither commanding nor retreating. It was the middle ground she had learned to occupy, neither drawing attention nor disappearing entirely. Observing, measuring, adjusting, a quiet diplomacy that required neither speech nor flair. And yet, beneath it all, there was a quiet anticipation, a thought that had lodged itself into her consciousness since the previous evening. The brothel worker, the one she had chosen, not the expected partner in social climbing, not a benefactor or protector with title or coin, but someone whose steadiness had resonated in a way that nothing else had. He would return, of course, eventually, perhaps later in the day, or perhaps not at all. That was the nature of his world, unpredictable in its own restrained way. And yet, even that uncertainty was preferable to the exaggerated displays of affection and attention that others offered. those performative gestures that required skillful evasion and careful management. Here, with him, life was quiet. It was tolerable. And for someone like Eliza, who had spent much of her life negotiating the chaotic and often absurd expectations of those above and around her, tolerable was more than sufficient. The morning continued with the measured rhythm of domestic obligation. Breakfast was modest: bread, a thin porridge, and water flavored faintly with lemon. She ate in silence, exchanging occasional glances or comments with the other girls, but mostly allowing the quiet to persist. Conversation here was gentle, strategic. Words were used sparingly, with awareness of tone, content, and implication. A misstep could be more than embarrassing, it could disrupt the fragile order maintained within these walls. By mid-morning, clients began their arrival, though in a less formal manner than the evenings, more tentative, exploratory. Eliza observed the interactions with a practiced detachment, noting the subtleties of posture, the rhythm of conversation, the expectations and missteps of each man who entered the parlor. It was a study in human behavior, conducted not in classrooms or salons, but in the quiet theater of a brothel, where social hierarchies collided and intermixed in ways both predictable and strange. Her own attention, however, remained partially occupied with the memory of the brothel worker, that calm presence that had disrupted the usual patterns of calculation and caution. She remembered the subtle curve of his lips, the unremarkable but steady cadence of his speech, the lack of pretense in his gestures. In a world governed by display, exaggeration, and constant negotiation, that absence of spectacle was remarkable in itself. He arrived eventually, not at a designated time, not announced or heralded, but with the casual inevitability of someone who understood the rhythms of the house and its occupants. His presence did not disturb, did not assert dominance. He merely existed within the space, a quiet actor in a world that often demanded performance from everyone else. "Good morning," he said, voice soft, eyes meeting hers with acknowledgement rather than expectation. There was no flourish, no dramatics, just presence, steady and unassuming. "Good morning," Eliza replied, noting the ease of the exchange, the lack of tension that so often accompanied even the simplest greetings in the house. They spoke briefly, again lightly, gently, about the city, the weather, small observations, and minor inconveniences. Each sentence, each word, carried the weight of ordinariness, and therein lay its charm. There was no pretense of intimacy, no performative display of interest, just two people occupying the same space, acknowledging each other's existence without exaggeration, without intrusion. When he touched her hand, it was brief, deliberate, considerate. There was no expectation, no urgency, only recognition. That recognition, subtle and unspoken, was sufficient to convey understanding, that she was more than the persona she presented to the world, that her choices, her inclinations, were seen and acknowledged without judgment. The house continued its rhythm around them. Other girls performed their roles. Clients arrived and departed. The house mistress oversaw proceedings with an unremarkable efficiency, maintaining control without fanfare. In this environment, Eliza found a rare luxury: the ability to exist without constant negotiation, to act without pretense, to inhabit a space where her decisions were respected rather than overridden. Their interaction extended into the afternoon. Conversation remained gentle, punctuated by small silences that were comfortable rather than awkward. There was no urgency, no insistence, no spectacle, just presence. And in presence, Eliza found a form of relief, a small reprieve from the chaos and expectations that otherwise structured her life. In the background, the city moved in its predictable patterns. Streets filled with merchants, carriages, and pedestrians, each engaged in its own version of performance. Markets operated with their own subtle hierarchies. Vendors negotiated and measured. The poor observed and maneuvered. Within the brothel, however, a separate world existed, bounded by its own rules, its own rhythms, its own logic. And within that microcosm, Eliza discovered the possibility of autonomy, of agency, of quiet selection. Even when the day stretched toward evening, when the more formal clients would arrive, the weight of expectation and performance did not press upon her in the same manner. She had already claimed, in small but decisive ways, her own domain, her own agency, her own choice of acknowledgement. The brothel worker, unremarkable in many ways to the casual observer, had become a vessel for that recognition, a quiet affirmation that existed beyond the currency of coin, title, or social standing. Meals were taken with minimal ceremony, chores completed in methodical fashion, and throughout it all, Eliza maintained her sense of self, subtle, deliberate, aware of the rhythms around her. Her movements, gestures, and interactions were measured, deliberate, precise, not for the sake of performance, but for the maintenance of order and comfort within the small, enclosed world she inhabited. She reflected briefly on the absurdities of social expectation, the disproportionate attention given to wealth, status, and superficial display, and the ease with which human desire and recognition could be misdirected. Here, in this carefully contained environment, she observed human behavior with the clarity afforded by proximity and repetition, and she noted again the quiet steadiness of the brothel worker, a presence that disrupted neither flow nor expectation, yet commanded acknowledgement through the simple act of existing attentively. Even the housemistress, a woman skilled in observation and negotiation, seemed to respect the understated dynamics between Eliza and her chosen companion. There was no interference, no attempt to redirect attention, no imposition of hierarchical authority beyond what was necessary to maintain functional order. In that small concession, Eliza found further affirmation of her decision, the acknowledgement of choice without disturbance, of selection without spectacle. As evening approached once more, the ambient noise of the city shifted subtly. Carriages clattered, voices rose and fell, and the distant scent of wood smoke drifted through partially opened windows. The house, in contrast, remained a locus of muted activity, controlled movement, and quiet observation. Within its walls, small dramas unfolded and resolved in soft rhythms, unnoticed by the larger world outside, yet significant to those contained within. Eliza prepared herself for the evening with the same deliberate care as before, dressing, hair arranging, the subtle application of makeup not for vanity but for continuity, a maintenance of expected roles. The brothel worker's presence in her thoughts served as a quiet anchor, a reminder of stability amid the patterned chaos of her environment. And when he returned later in the night, as was often his habit, it was with the same understated assurance that had initially drawn her attention, his presence neither demanding nor ornamental, merely existing in a way that confirmed her own sense of identity and agency. The night stretched onward, measured by the rhythm of footsteps, whispered conversation, and the occasional cough or murmur from elsewhere in the house. The brothel worker's visit, brief yet significant, reinforced the subtle dynamics that Eliza had chosen to cultivate. Acknowledgement without display, intimacy without obligation, recognition without performance. It was a pattern she found deeply comforting, a rare constancy in a life otherwise governed by the unpredictable and often absurd dictates of social and professional expectation. And as the hour deepened, the house settled into its habitual nocturnal rhythm. Candles burned low, shadows lengthened, and the soft, pervasive aroma of flowers and human habitation enveloped the rooms. Eliza, in her small, private chamber, reflected again on the quiet decisions that had shaped her evening, her life, her sense of self within this small, chaotic ecosystem. In these moments, she recognized the subtle, enduring power of choice, the rare satisfaction of alignment between personal inclination and external acknowledgement, and the profound simplicity of connection that was neither transactional nor performative. The brothel worker, unassuming and ordinary in so many respects, had become the focal point of that understanding, the tangible manifestation of a decision made quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. The night deepened further. Footsteps slowed, voices diminished. Even the occasional laughter of distant patrons faded into subdued whispers. Within the brothel, the rhythm of human activity persisted, albeit at a gentler pace, punctuated by the soft murmur of those still awake and the comforting presence of those who had already surrendered to rest. Eliza, nestled within her modest bed, allowed her mind to drift into the soft, unstructured realms of thought that precede sleep. She thought not of grandeur, not of power, not of social standing, but of moments, choices, and acknowledgments. The brothel worker's presence lingered, a quiet affirmation of existence and agency, a subtle reminder that her life, though constrained and complicated, contained islands of deliberate decision, of calm, and of recognition untainted by artifice. And in that gentle, measured contemplation, as shadows stretched across walls and candlelight flickered, she surrendered fully to the slow, steady descent into sleep, the body and mind following the unhurried cadence of respiration, heartbeat, and the quiet, unremarkable, yet enduring affirmation of personal choice, acknowledgement, and the enduring affirmation of personal choice, acknowledgement, and the small, steady comfort of mutual recognition that required neither grandeur nor ceremony. It was remarkable in its ordinariness, the way something so subtle could feel so significant when contrasted with the exaggerated performances that surrounded her daily. The candlelight flickered again, stretching long, lazy shadows across the walls of a modest room. She traced the patterns unconsciously, letting her mind wander along the lines of light, imagining the quiet geometry of the room as if it had been designed specifically to accommodate these small, almost invisible pleasures. Outside, the city continued its distant, indistinct murmur, but here, in her own carefully measured sphere, the world was soft-edged, its edges blurred by habit and the gentle insistence of familiarity. He had promised nothing. He offered no protection, no assurances of wealth, no gestures grand enough to echo beyond the walls of their immediate space. And yet, that absence of promise was its own form of comfort. Here, she was not a commodity, not a vessel for ambition, not a tool for social maneuvering. She was merely herself, acknowledged without performance, recognized without expectation. The day's minor irritations, the fleeting jealousies of other girls, the occasional brusque client, the whispering of the house mistress retreated into insignificance in the presence of this quiet equilibrium. Eliza could move, breathe, and exist without negotiating or defending herself at every turn. The brothel worker, in his simple steadiness, had become a counterweight to the chaos of her surroundings, a small anchor in a sea that otherwise required constant vigilance. Even when she imagined the world beyond these walls, with its grand halls, ostentatious ceremonies, and convoluted social obligations, she found herself returning mentally to the modest room, the faint smell of wax and rose, and the quiet presence of someone who existed simply without performance. The contrast was stark. In a society obsessed with appearances, the subtleties of recognition and mutual understanding seemed almost revolutionary. Eliza thought of her childhood, a period largely defined by observation and measured retreat. She had learned early on that display often demanded sacrifice, the sacrifice of authenticity, the surrender of inclination, the subordination of desire to the expectations of those with greater power, greater title, or greater coin. Here, those lessons were subtly inverted. Within the brothel, she was not required to perform, yet she could still choose, could still engage in subtle, meaningful interaction on her own terms. The brothel worker had become a touchstone for this delicate, understated autonomy. Time passed quietly, marked less by clocks than by subtle shifts in light, temperature, and sound. Conversation ebbed and flowed, measured and tentative, never demanding, never urgent. When he spoke, it was with the soft cadence of observation rather than instruction. When she responded, it was measured, deliberate, careful, yet entirely sincere. There was no need for theatricality, no compulsion to impress or negotiate dominance. Each interaction was a small reaffirmation of their mutual understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that they occupied the same small, contained world, yet did so without burdening each other with the expectations of the broader, often absurd society outside. Other girls observed with varying degrees of curiosity, envy, or indifference. Some had long accustomed themselves to the rhythms of connection and choice within these walls, recognizing the quiet politics that structured every smile, every glance, every gentle touch. Others, newer or less attuned, sometimes misread gestures or assumed significance where there was none. But Eliza, with her practiced detachment and subtle intelligence, navigated these currents effortlessly, her choices carefully protected and deliberately enacted. In the evening, when the house took on a more deliberate activity, welcoming clients who sought a combination of conversation, performance, and intimacy, Eliza maintained her poise. The brothel worker's visit remained the point of personal equilibrium, a reminder that even amid ritualized negotiation, she retained agency. And though interactions with clients required strategy, tact, and a carefully calibrated balance of attention and distance, she found solace in the small, recurring presence of someone who demanded nothing yet offered acknowledgement in return. She often found herself reflecting not with dramatic intensity but with quiet curiosity on the contrast between this modest, intimate connection and the exaggerated gestures that so often governed relationships outside. Here, recognition did not require wealth, status, or pretense. It required only attentiveness, subtlety, and the willingness to meet another human being on equal, if modest, terms. And for someone who had long inhabited a world of constant evaluation, negotiation, and performative expectation, that simplicity was profound. Nights were particularly conducive to such reflection. The streets beyond the walls had quieted. Lamps cast faint halos through fog and mist, and the distant sound of carriage wheels and street vendors faded into the subdued rhythm of nocturnal urban life. Within the house, the pace slowed, and the occasional laughter or murmur of remaining patrons became part of a gentle, continuous background hum. Eliza, enveloped by candlelight and the quiet assurance of familiar presence, allowed herself to think in unhurried stretches, tracing connections between memory, sensation, and deliberate choice. The brothel worker remained, in her imagination, a subtle constant, a quiet assertion that amidst the intricate social dance and carefully orchestrated performances required elsewhere, there existed the space in which choice could exist unimpeded by title, wealth, or expectation. He had no need to perform, she had no need to negotiate, and within that simplicity, a form of intimacy unfolded, understated, deliberate, and profoundly stabilizing. She recalled moments early in the week, interactions that had seemed insignificant at the time, and now revealed themselves as subtly formative. A brief touch, a shared glance, a small acknowledgement of preference or inclination. The details were ordinary, yet the accumulation created a quiet resonance, a sense of constancy in a life otherwise defined by flux. The brothel worker, in his ordinariness, became extraordinary, precisely because he represented the absence of pressure, the presence of attentive recognition, and the possibility of mutual acknowledgement without artifice. The hours passed slowly, measured by candlelight and respiration. Each movement, each choice was deliberate, unhurried, deliberate again. Eliza understood, with a growing sense of clarity, that the very ordinariness of her companion was what rendered the connection meaningful. In a world obsessed with display and the exaggeration of desire, the capacity to be recognized simply, attentively, and quietly was a rare and valuable gift. And as she closed her eyes, listening to the faint, continuous murmur of life around her, the gentle creak of floorboards, the distant cough of a tired servant, the soft clinking of objects in preparation for the night, she acknowledged that the world outside might never understand the significance of small gestures, deliberate choices, or quiet acknowledgement. But within this modest chamber, within this carefully contained rhythm of interaction, she had discovered a form of stability, of agency, and of human connection that required nothing more than presence, attentiveness, and the gentle, enduring affirmation of being seen. She opened her eyes slowly, aware first of the muted glow of the candles, then of the subtle rhythm of his breathing in the quiet room. It was remarkable, almost miraculous, that a human being could create such a sense of stability simply by existing in predictable patterns, by being reliably present without expectation, without the need for ceremony. Her thoughts drifted over the long day, over the small gestures that had shaped it, a careful tilt of his head in acknowledgement, the soft alignment of his hands while performing tasks, the slight humor hidden behind the steady gaze. These details, insignificant to the casual observer, were the pillars upon which her sense of comfort rested, and she recognized them with a mixture of gratitude and quiet astonishment. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, though its intensity was muffled here, where walls and candlelight combined to create a gentle, protective shell. Eliza considered the broader world, the great estates, the titled families, the displays of wealth and influence, and she felt, without dramatic judgment, that those lives seemed more fragile than they appeared. Performance, after all, demanded constant attention. It was exhausting to navigate, to maintain the appearance of poise, cleverness, and competence, while simultaneously concealing irritation, desire, or fatigue. The brothel worker offered a counterpoint to all this, a demonstration that quiet attentiveness could carry meaning as weighty as gold, as binding as political alliance, and as enduring as family obligation. She thought of her own upbringing, of the subtle lessons imparted in whispered tones, in moments when she was instructed to smile, to bow, to measure her laughter, to moderate the tremor of her hand. These were lessons in control, in concealment, in the management of perception. And yet, here, within these modest walls, she found herself unlearning, undoing some of those meticulous instructions. The worker's presence, unassuming and deliberate, required no such performance. She could exist with imperfection and still be acknowledged, still be valued, still be noticed. It was not that he was perfect. Far from it. He had flaws, as all humans do. Perhaps he was slow to react to certain needs, or perhaps he spoke when silence would have been better. Perhaps his hands trembled slightly when performing a delicate task, or his voice carried a quiet nervousness in unfamiliar conversation. But none of this diminished him. Indeed, it humanized him. It underscored the authenticity of the connection they shared, the mutual acceptance of each other's idiosyncrasies. Eliza found this far more compelling than the orchestrated gestures of the wealthy men who occasionally visited the house, whose smiles were often rehearsed, whose attentiveness was sometimes nothing more than polite calculation. Over time, she began to notice subtle patterns in their interactions, patterns that were comforting in their predictability. When she moved about the room, he adjusted his movements to accommodate her path without intrusion. When she spoke softly, he leaned slightly forward, attentive, yet never imposing. When she paused, lost in thought, he waited with a quiet patience that might have been invisible to others, yet was profoundly felt by her. These rhythms created a shared language, unspoken but palpable, a conversation of presence and acknowledgement that required no words at all. The house itself, for all its reputation and the carefully managed illusions it maintained for clients, became a stage in which these small personal rituals took on disproportionate significance. Eliza understood, with a subtle amusement, that the broader theatrics, the dramatic entrances, the whispered negotiations, the ostentatious displays of beauty and charm were largely irrelevant to her own sense of satisfaction. Here, within this corner of the world, the drama was muted, replaced by the quiet insistence of consistent presence. Even mundane moments gained weight. She recalled a recent afternoon when she had asked him to fetch water from the nearby well. He returned with careful precision, balancing the bucket in a manner that seemed unnecessarily deliberate, yet utterly considerate. There was no grand gesture, no expectation of gratitude beyond her unspoken acknowledgement. And yet, the memory of that simple act carried with it a profound sense of reliability, a demonstration of attention that spoke louder than any declaration of devotion or wealth could have. In the evenings, after the clients had departed and the house settled into its softer rhythm, Eliza would sit by the window and watch the faint, diffuse light of distant lanterns flicker across the cobbled streets. The brothel worker would sit nearby, often quietly, occasionally offering a comment on some trivial observation, an errant cat navigating a fence, the sound of footsteps in the alley, but always in a manner that invited reflection rather than demanded response. There was a gentle interplay here, a subtle negotiation of attention and autonomy, a recognition that intimacy need not be loud or dramatic to be meaningful. She thought also of the contrast between him and the men of her previous experience. There had been lords who visited with rigid expectations, whose presence was heavy with obligation and consequence. There had been princes whose charm carried with it an implicit demand for admiration and submission. Compared to them, the brothel worker seemed almost miraculous in his ordinariness, almost revolutionary in his refusal to insist upon grandeur or significance. Here, the human capacity for connection was measured not by title or coin, but by attentiveness, subtle recognition, and the capacity to exist alongside another person without intrusion. And yet, The world outside continued its quiet insistence, pressing upon them with the inevitability of social hierarchy, rumor, and expectation. She was aware that her choices, though deliberately private, carried echoes in broader circles. The whispered astonishment of other girls, the occasional disapproving glance from patrons accustomed to more conventional forms of attachment, the subtle evaluation by house staff of her inclinations and loyalties. But these pressures, while present, were largely external. Within the small chamber where she existed in quiet interplay with him, they were muted, almost irrelevant, like distant sounds, softened by layers of insulation and understanding. Over the weeks and months, the pattern became increasingly established. Certain routines developed, small rituals that, while modest, carried an unspoken weight. The careful alignment of furniture, the routine preparation of meals, the subtle exchange of glances in moments of shared observation, all these contributed to a sense of stability that was otherwise rare in her life. The brothel worker, by virtue of his steady attentiveness, became both a mirror and a grounding point, reflecting back her own capacity for agency and providing a touchstone amidst the fluctuations of her environment. She recognized that these moments were fragile in their own way. The slightest disruption, a sudden visitor, a misaligned gesture, a miscommunication could unsettle the equilibrium. And yet, the fragility was itself part of the pattern, part of the rhythm that made each act of recognition, each small demonstration of attentiveness feel vital and precious. There was, she realized, a subtle tension inherent in meaningful connection, the balance between continuity and change, between presence and absence, between the predictable and the unpredictable. He, too, seemed attuned to these subtleties. He navigated them with the quiet skill of someone who had long observed human behavior without imposing upon it, who understood that small, deliberate actions often carried more weight than grand declarations. There was a soft humor in the way he moved through the room, a subtle acknowledgement of the absurdities of life within the house, yet never a need to exaggerate or dramatize. In his steadiness, she found reassurance. In his quiet attentiveness, a form of intimacy that required neither ceremony nor performance. The broader rhythms of life continued, as they always do. The city beyond the walls pressed onward, indifferent to the small dramas, minor choices, and subtle affirmations occurring within this modest chamber. Yet for Eliza, these were not trivial. They were, in their understated way, profoundly significant. They represented the space in which agency, choice, and recognition could exist without the distortions of title, wealth, or societal expectation. Here, intimacy was measured not by spectacle, but by consistency, attentiveness, and the gentle acknowledgement of another's existence. In this quietness, she found herself reflecting on the nature of desire and fulfillment. She considered, with mild irony, the elaborate gestures of suitors past, the intricate negotiations of attention, the subtle pressures to conform to expectation. Compared to these, the steady presence of the brothel worker felt almost revolutionary, an assertion that human connection could thrive without performance, that recognition could exist without transaction, that intimacy could unfold without the constant imposition of external standards. Days blurred into nights with gentle continuity. The routine became rhythm, and the rhythm became reassurance. Each small gesture, each unspoken acknowledgement layered upon the previous, creating a cumulative sense of security and belonging that was both subtle and profoundly real. Eliza observed this with a quiet attentiveness, noting the ways in which her own behavior adapted, how her awareness of choice and autonomy deepened, and how the cumulative presence of simple attentiveness could create a sense of emotional equilibrium that was otherwise rare in her life. And yet, she knew, with a calm understanding that was neither anxious nor dramatic, that this was not permanence. Life, after all, was defined by motion, by fluctuation, by the subtle interplay of expectation and reality. Even within the stable rhythms of her current existence, there remained the possibility of disruption, the potential for small or large shifts that could unsettle the patterns they had established. But this awareness did not breed anxiety. Rather, it highlighted the value of presence, the significance of attentiveness, and the quiet profundity of being acknowledged without performance or pretense. Even the smallest details assumed significance over time. A glance held a fraction longer than usual. A hand brushed against the surface with deliberate care. The tone of a question carried a subtle variation that spoke volumes. These minor fluctuations, imperceptible to outsiders, became markers in the slow, deliberate narrative of mutual understanding and subtle intimacy. She found herself noticing these shifts with an almost meditative attention, cataloging them not for judgment but for appreciation, allowing each small recognition to reinforce the quiet sense of continuity that had become central to her experience. The brothel worker, in his modesty, seemed to embody a principle of understated constancy. He did not strive to impress, did not manipulate circumstance, did not seek accolades or acknowledgement from outside. His attentiveness was both deliberate and unassuming, creating a foundation upon which Eliza could build a sense of security, a measure of trust, and a recognition of her own capacity for choice. In a world defined by expectation, performance, and social calculation, this ordinariness became paradoxically extraordinary. Her reflections extended, naturally, into considerations of broader human behavior. She observed the contrast between the theatricality demanded in other interactions among visitors, suitors, or even fellow inhabitants of the house, and the simplicity of genuine acknowledgement. It became increasingly evident to her that the essence of connection, the subtle thread that binds one person to another, often existed not in grand gesture, but in attentive recognition, in the willingness to notice and respond without imposition. The brothel worker embodied this principle, and through him she began to appreciate the quiet, cumulative power of small, deliberate acts of attentiveness. The morning arrived with its usual indifference, sunlight spilling softly through the curtains and painting the room in pale gold and muted shadows. Eliza remained where she had settled the night before, allowing the slow rise of the day to drift over her consciousness like a gentle tide. The quiet sounds of the house began to take shape, the faint creak of floorboards as other workers moved through hallways, the distant hum of voices softened by walls and doors, the occasional metallic clink from utensils or bowls. There was an intimacy in these sounds, a reminder that life continued beyond her own space, yet in a manner that did not intrude upon it. He stirred beside her, not abruptly, not with any need for dramatics, but in a measured rhythm that spoke of habit, consistency, and familiarity. The quietness of his presence was almost an extension of the room itself, a natural component of the environment, rather than an external imposition. Eliza observed him for a moment, appreciating, with that subtle, ironic awareness that had become characteristic of her reflections, how extraordinary it was that a person could exert influence simply by existing without performance or proclamation. She found herself silently amused that the presence of such ordinariness could feel so significant, almost revolutionary, in a world that celebrated spectacle above all else. Breakfast was unremarkable, yet each small gesture held meaning. The brothel worker moved with deliberate care, arranging the items on the table, ensuring her portion was prepared without drawing attention to the effort. There was a quiet choreography in his movements, unspoken but palpable, a testament to attentiveness rather than showmanship. She ate slowly, noticing how even the smallest attention to detail, the angle of a bowl, the careful placement of a spoon, conveyed a sense of recognition and consideration that her previous experiences had rarely provided. There was no need for flattery, no expectation of gratitude. Simply, the act itself was sufficient. Eliza's mind wandered through the delicate histories of her own upbringing, of the intricate webs of expectation and obligation that had shaped her early life. Her family had been preoccupied with appearances, with alliances, with the careful measurement of influence and perception. Love, affection, and personal connection had existed, yes, but always as adjuncts to the broader calculus of status and propriety. In contrast, the intimacy she now experienced was stripped of pretense, measured not by wealth, title, or social advantage, but by the quiet acknowledgement of presence. The irony, which she could not resist, noting even in the subdued seriousness of her reflections, was that the simplest, humblest gestures carried far more emotional weight than any declaration of grandeur ever had. The hours drifted by with gentle continuity. Tasks were performed cleaning, organizing, tending to minor household details, but each was imbued with subtle significance because of the shared context, the quiet interplay between two people accustomed to each other's rhythms. She observed him moving through the space, noticing the small hesitations, the adjustments made to accommodate her presence, the way he anticipated needs without overt consultation. These nuances, unnoticed by outsiders, became essential markers of reliability and attentiveness, and she found herself cataloging them in her mind with a calm, meditative attention. Visitors came, as they always did, yet their presence felt almost irrelevant in comparison to the ongoing, unspoken dialogue of ordinary attentiveness. Lords and minor nobility, curious or seeking distraction, offered words of flattery, small coins, or invitations of varying significance. Some attempted charm, others relied on the weight of social expectation, all under the assumption that grandeur could substitute for connection. Eliza, however, found her attention inevitably returning to him. The contrast was stark. The elaborate gestures of these men were transient, superficial, and often exhausting, whereas the steady, deliberate attentiveness of her companion provided a quiet, emotional anchor. It was during one of these afternoons, when a particularly persistent visitor lingered, that she became aware of the subtle social dynamics that her choice had introduced. The other girls in the house watched with a mixture of curiosity and quiet amusement, perhaps noting the unusual seriousness with which she treated her interactions with him, or perhaps simply remarking on the contrast between ordinary affection and performative attention. There was no scandal, no dramatic tension, merely a quiet recognition that she had chosen differently. The choice itself and the cumulative significance of small, deliberate acts of attentiveness seemed to create a private world alongside the more conventional patterns of interest and attention around her. Even the worker's imperfections assumed significance, though in a way entirely different from the judgment often imposed by society. A misaligned gesture, a delayed response, a hesitation before action, all became points of reflection, subtle moments to appreciate the balance between human flaw and intention. Where other suitors might have been judged harshly for such minor lapses, here they became part of the rhythm, integral to the authenticity of their interactions. In a sense, she learned to value imperfection, to notice it not as deficiency, but as a marker of genuine engagement, of presence, of care. The rhythm of days and nights continued without abrupt interruption. Eliza found herself anticipating small moments, subtle affirmations of connection that existed beyond words or ceremony. A shared glance across a room, a gentle adjustment of a chair, the careful placement of objects all became significant, woven into a narrative of trust and recognition that unfolded without fanfare or performance. In these quiet, cumulative gestures, she discovered the new measure of human attachment, one that did not depend upon spectacle, influence, or wealth, but upon the reliability and attentiveness of shared presence. And yet, the broader world persisted beyond these small moments. Rumors, social expectations, and casual observations continued to press inward, subtle yet persistent, shaping perception even if not directly interfering with lived experience. Eliza recognized the dichotomy between the interior life of quiet attentiveness and the exterior world of observation and expectation. There was a certain amusement, tinged with irony, in noting how little these external factors could affect the deep, cumulative significance of unremarkable yet deliberate actions. Where titles and wealth might impress and dominate in public spaces, here, in private, such measures were almost irrelevant. It was in the evenings, when the muted glow of candlelight replaced the diffuse daylight, that she reflected most fully upon the contrast between her current experience and previous exposures to human connection. The worker, with his quiet attentiveness and modest presence, offered a model of engagement that was both restorative and challenging. It was restorative because it provided a sense of continuity and recognition absent from most interactions with the world at large. It was challenging because it required her to engage deeply with the subtleties of presence, to notice, to attend, to participate in a relationship built not upon spectacle, but upon careful observation, responsiveness, and mutual acknowledgement. She sometimes allowed herself a quiet, ironic amusement at the contrast between what society considered important and the reality she now inhabited. While lords and visitors performed in elaborate displays, seeking to impress, to demonstrate wealth, or to negotiate influence, the worker's attentiveness required none of these things. It was, in effect, a quiet revolution, a demonstration that human connection could exist, even flourish, in the absence of grandeur, and that value could be measured not in coins or titles, but in subtle, consistent recognition. As months passed, the rhythm solidified further. Small, seemingly insignificant habits gained weight, and subtle patterns emerged, both comforting and instructive. The alignment of chairs in the sitting room, the deliberate positioning of bowls and utensils, the careful arrangement of objects to facilitate ease of movement, each became part of a quiet choreography, a shared understanding that required no formal instruction. Eliza noticed how even the slightest deviation, a misaligned spoon, a delayed gesture, a forgotten habit could be observed, recognized, and reintegrated into the ongoing rhythm without judgment, merely with attentive care. This attention to detail extended beyond the practical into the emotional. Subtle cues, tone, expression, hesitation, posture were noticed, catalogued, and responded to with a quiet, measured care that was profoundly reassuring. Where other relationships she had known required performance, calculation, or compromise of self, this dynamic allowed for authenticity, for acknowledgement of imperfection, for a mutual recognition of humanity. It was, in its understated way, extraordinary, a quiet counterpoint to the performance-driven relationships she had experienced previously. Occasionally, she allowed herself to reflect upon the broader social implications of her choice. The contrast between the ordinariness of the worker and the expectations of society became increasingly evident. There were subtle pressures, unspoken yet persistent, to conform to more conventional measures of attachment and value, to favor wealth, title, or performance over steadiness, presence, and attentiveness. Yet these pressures were mostly external. Within the private sphere they occupied, they had minimal force. The quiet, cumulative acts of attention, recognition, and mutual care outweighed, in practical experience, if not in social perception, any external expectation. She also noted the humor, mild and ironic, that accompanied these contrasts. Society's insistence on grandeur, her family's preoccupation with appearance, the performative gestures of visitors all seemed slightly absurd when juxtaposed against the weight of steady attentiveness, the subtle, ongoing affirmation of shared presence. And yet, she found herself appreciating these contrasts, recognizing that their irony did not diminish their significance, but rather highlighted the quiet power of ordinary, deliberate human action. Even the house itself seemed to adjust to their patterns. Spaces were used in ways that facilitated subtle engagement, chairs positioned to allow unobtrusive observation, small objects arranged to invite interaction, rooms structured to enable simultaneous privacy and attentiveness. It was as though the house itself had become a participant in the ongoing dialogue of presence, adapting quietly to support the rhythms that had emerged between them. Eliza observed with calm amusement that the worker himself was not unaware of these patterns. His attentiveness extended beyond immediate tasks into the domain of understanding the subtle, cumulative dynamics of shared living. He seemed to anticipate minor needs, to notice slight fluctuations in mood, to respond to minor disruptions in rhythm, all without any suggestion of performance. There was a soft intelligence in this, an understanding that intimacy and recognition could be conveyed not through grand gesture, but through consistent, understated attentiveness. The days merged into weeks with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. Eliza noticed how easily the ordinary became extraordinary when observed closely. There was a gentle satisfaction in the way the worker moved through the spaces of their shared life, attending to details so minor that they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. The quiet folding of linens, the deliberate alignment of chairs, the careful placing of each cup and plate, each small act carried weight far beyond its apparent significance. It was not that the actions themselves were extraordinary. They were mundane, predictable, and consistent. It was precisely that reliability, that unspoken acknowledgement of presence, that distinguished them from all the ostentation she had known elsewhere. She began to catalog these details in her mind with a peculiar sense of reverence, a quiet awareness that these small gestures created a framework for trust and recognition. Trust, she realized, was not built on proclamations or dramatic expressions, but on the accumulation of repeated, ordinary attentiveness. Each day added a new layer to that foundation. Even minor hesitations or errors were noted but not judged. Instead, they were absorbed into the rhythm, accommodated as part of the living pattern of attention and response. Eliza found herself reflecting on the contrast between this private world and the public one that surrounded it. Visitors, acquaintances, and distant family members continued to offer gestures, coins, and words of encouragement or judgment, assuming that social display could substitute for genuine connection. She watched with mild amusement as lords fumbled with charm, as young men attempted wit or generosity, all with the underlying assumption that surface-level impression could dictate value. Yet, in her private world, these measures had little relevance. She observed the irony without bitterness, noting that those who measured importance by spectacle often found themselves lacking when confronted with the quiet power of consistent, deliberate attention. Evenings became particularly reflective times. The room, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, seemed to absorb the day's subtleties, offering a gentle environment for meditation. The worker moved through the room with habitual care, attending to minor tasks, his gestures precise but unobtrusive. Eliza would watch him, noting the subtle shifts of posture, the careful sequencing of movement, the way he seemed to anticipate needs before they were articulated. These observations were neither obsessive nor anxious. They were quiet affirmations of connection, reminders that attention, when directed consistently, could create a profound emotional landscape, even in the absence of grandeur. Occasionally, she allowed herself a wry acknowledgement of the social absurdities that lingered outside this private sphere. The insistence upon wealth, title, or social alignment seemed almost comical when viewed against the backdrop of these cumulative, understated acts. The fact that a brothel worker ordinarily overlooked, undervalued, and socially marginalized could provide more meaningful engagement than titled suitors or wealthy patrons amused her, though always quietly, with a gentle, ironic smile. It was a soft humor, one that required careful attention to appreciate, and that acknowledged the strange inversions of value that history and society repeatedly produced. Children and apprentices came and went in the house, each adding small variations to the ongoing patterns. They were often curious, sometimes mischievous, but always incorporated into the rhythm with a mixture of guidance and permissive attention. The worker engaged with them patiently, modeling a quiet attentiveness that contrasted sharply with the performative gestures of those who sought authority through shouting, command, or intimidation. Eliza observed, sometimes with subtle irony, the ways in which simple, consistent attention could command obedience, cooperation, and respect far more effectively than any display of power or wealth. There were moments of minor disagreement or friction, though these were never dramatic. A misaligned object, a delayed response, a small misunderstanding could briefly disrupt the rhythm, but each instance was met with calm adjustment rather than dramatics. Eliza found herself appreciating the emotional intelligence required to navigate these minor disturbances, the subtle negotiation of attention and response that maintained continuity without the need for conflict or escalation. In these quiet negotiations, she noticed the broader patterns of human connection, of empathy and patience, which were rarely acknowledged by the society outside their walls. The worker's own past occasionally surfaced in glimpses, subtle hints dropped in conversation or observation. There were stories of hardship, minor misfortunes, and modest triumphs, none dramatic by conventional standards, but all informative in their quiet context. Eliza listened, absorbing these narratives without interruption or overt analysis. The act of listening itself became a form of intimacy, a recognition of experience that required no embellishment, no dramatic interpretation. It was a gentle acknowledgement of life as it had been lived, a recognition of value beyond social estimation or material reward. The rhythm of days continued with a steady, unremarkable continuity. There were tasks to complete, chores to attend, minor repairs, and adjustments that required attention. Each activity, though ordinary in isolation, became part of a larger pattern of shared presence and recognition. The worker moved through these tasks with calm efficiency, not seeking praise, not demanding acknowledgement, simply fulfilling the requirements of daily life with consistent attention. Eliza observed, noted, and reflected, finding meaning in the stability, the predictability, and the quiet demonstration of reliability. Occasionally, letters arrived from distant family or acquaintances, bearing social expectations, inquiries, or subtle judgments. Elisa read them with a sense of detached amusement, noting the dissonance between the social imperatives contained within and the lived reality of her private environment. The expectations of wealth, propriety, and alliance were almost irrelevant when compared to the accumulated weight of attentiveness and shared experience that structured her daily life. She observed the irony without bitterness, noting the persistent human tendency to overvalue spectacle while undervaluing subtlety, consistency, and quiet recognition. There were evenings of reflection, moments when the quiet glow of lamps and candles illuminated the soft patterns of domestic life. Eliza would sit with a book, occasionally reading aloud, though often simply allowing her thoughts to wander. The worker remained nearby, engaged in minor tasks or quietly observing, providing a presence that required no explicit performance but conveyed reassurance, attentiveness, and constancy. These moments, though seemingly mundane, were imbued with a significance that eclipsed the formal gestures, declarations, and social maneuvers of her previous experiences. In these quiet hours, Eliza sometimes thought about the contrast between her choice and the broader societal expectations. Choosing the worker over suitors of title or wealth was not a decision marked by fanfare or defiance. It was a subtle, continuous affirmation of what she valued in human connection. She appreciated, with soft amusement, that the quietness of her choice would likely be misunderstood, misrepresented, or entirely ignored by those who evaluated significance solely through social or material lenses. Yet within the private space she inhabited, the choice was continuously reaffirmed by the accumulated gestures, attentiveness, and shared rhythm of ordinary life. The worker's presence remained consistently calm, his movements deliberate, his attention steady. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic demonstrations of affection or loyalty. Instead, there was the continuous unfolding of ordinary actions imbued with subtle significance. Adjusting a chair, placing a bowl, noting a slight change in posture or expression, all became points of connection, markers of mutual recognition that quietly reinforced trust, care, and engagement. Eliza observed these gestures with quiet attention, cataloging them in her mind not as evidence of obligation or performance, but as proof of sustained, reliable attentiveness. Small rituals developed over time. A particular arrangement of chairs in the sitting room, the placement of candles to catch the evening light, the sequence of preparing meals each became part of a gentle choreography of presence. These rituals were not enforced or formalized. They emerged organically as patterns of attention and response stabilized. Eliza noticed, with soft amusement, how the ordinariness of these routines contained a form of extraordinary significance, one that no social performance or display of grandeur could replicate. Occasionally, she allowed herself to reflect on the emotional subtleties that characterized their interactions. Minor expressions, a glance, a tone of voice, a hesitation conveyed meaning far more potent than words or ceremony. She recognized the intelligence required to navigate these subtleties, the attentiveness necessary to respond appropriately, and the patience required to maintain continuity without overt direction. In this quiet, continuous observation, she found a measure of understanding that had eluded her in previous relationships, a recognition of connection that transcended the superficial metrics of society, title, or wealth. The world beyond the house persisted, as it always did, with its social structures, expectations, and judgments. Eliza occasionally considered how her choice would be interpreted by others. Some would admire, others would disapprove, and most would likely fail to grasp the quiet profundity of the connections she had cultivated. Yet these considerations were mostly irrelevant. Within the private sphere of daily routines, attentiveness, and shared presence, the external metrics of status, wealth, and spectacle held minimal influence. The quiet consistency of ordinary actions, repeated and observed over time, had a weight that no social expectation could counterbalance. As weeks turned into months, the shared rhythm solidified further. The workers' habits, attentiveness, and quiet presence became integral to the pattern of daily life. Eliza observed the development of subtle mutual understanding, the emergence of anticipatory gestures, the recognition of small emotional shifts, and the ongoing reinforcement of trust and connection. These accumulated gestures, mundane in isolation but profound in continuity, created a private narrative of presence, care, and subtle intimacy that was largely invisible to the outside world. Even small inconveniences or disruptions were incorporated into this rhythm with minimal friction. A spilled cup, a delayed response, a minor misunderstanding all became moments for subtle negotiation, reflection, and adjustment rather than conflict or drama. Eliza noted the quiet skill with which these disruptions were managed, the patience and attentiveness that allowed continuity to be maintained without overt imposition or performance. These moments reinforced the significance of subtlety, consistency, and quiet recognition in shaping meaningful connection. He stepped into the quiet kitchen just as the first pale light of morning began to filter through the narrow windows, illuminating the slight dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Eliza was already there, moving slowly, deliberately, her hands folding a linen with a care that made the simple act seem ceremonious. He watched, silently, noting the subtle rhythm of her gestures, the quiet precision with which she arranged things, and the small, almost imperceptible sighs that punctuated her movements. There was an unspoken pattern in the way they shared these early hours, a gentle choreography that required neither instruction nor discussion, only mutual observation and understated acknowledgement. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the kind where the absence of conversation spoke as loudly as words might have. The worker poured tea with measured movements, the steam rising in thin tendrils that caught the light. Eliza lifted her cup with a habitual grace, her eyes scanning the small kitchen, noting the alignment of plates and the orderliness of the space. It was a scene that outsiders would have dismissed as mundane, yet for her it carried layers of meaning. Each movement, each gesture was a signal of attention, a reminder that even in the absence of spoken affection, there was a steady, reliable presence that could be trusted. She had observed this in him from the earliest days. It was not his strength, nor his charm, nor even his quiet humor that had drawn her, though each contributed in small ways. It was the consistency, the ability to occupy the same space day after day, with the same gentle attentiveness to notice without judgment, to respond without display. Other men, some of noble birth and considerable fortune, had come and gone, offering grand gestures, elaborate promises, and the spectacle of wealth. None had lasted, none had produced the quiet, steady comfort that his presence provided. There was a subtle power in that stability, one that history, with all its emphasis on spectacle and title, rarely acknowledged. The morning passed in soft rhythm, each attending to their own tasks, yet ever aware of the other. Eliza moved through the house, straightening books, checking candles, adjusting cushions, her movements fluid and unhurried. The worker shadowed her with a discreet attentiveness, attending to minor details: a dropped spoon, a misaligned rug, a thread needing mending without drawing attention to his efforts. It was a dance of presence, unspoken and unremarkable, yet suffused with care. In these ordinary acts, Eliza found a profound reassurance, a sense of continuity and reliability that contrasted sharply with the chaotic expectations of the society beyond their walls. Letters occasionally arrived, folded neatly and sealed with wax, carrying inquiries, requests, or subtle reminders of family obligations. Eliza would read them quietly, often with a wry smile, noting the absurdity of social expectation. One cousin insisted on arranging a match with a wealthy merchant, citing the importance of alliances and prosperity. Another distant aunt offered advice, always in the tone of moral correction, about the dangers of imprudent choices. She would place these missives aside, their content noted but not absorbed, for the reality of her daily life, the steady rhythm of attention and shared tasks, was of far greater significance than any external expectation. Children, apprentices, and occasional visitors added gentle interruptions to the pattern. The worker engaged with them patiently, modeling calm attentiveness that contrasted sharply with the performative authority often demanded by those of rank. Eliza observed with soft amusement how this quiet, consistent guidance elicited cooperation and respect without need for command or display. It was an education in human interaction, a subtle curriculum of presence and attention that no formal instruction could replicate. In these small lessons, she saw a reflection of the broader patterns of connection that underpinned their household, a microcosm of relational dynamics where patience, observation, and consistency held more weight than proclamation or spectacle. The afternoon brought minor tasks: repairing a door hinge, tending to a small garden, washing and folding linens, all approached with the same quiet care. The worker moved through these activities with deliberate attention, never rushed, never boastful, yet fully present. Eliza found herself noting the subtle cues of habit, the faint rituals that had developed over months of shared space. There was a kind of poetry in the repetition, a rhythm that marked the passage of time more effectively than any calendar or clock. Each ordinary act was a testament to reliability, each minor adjustment a quiet assertion of attentiveness, and in this cumulative subtlety, Eliza found profound comfort. Evenings were slower, more reflective. Candles were lit with deliberate care, the soft glow bathing the room in warmth. Eliza often sat with a book, occasionally reading aloud, though more frequently allowing her mind to wander over the subtleties of the day. The worker remained nearby, engaged in minor tasks or quietly observing, offering a presence that required no overt expression to communicate its significance. There was a gentle humor in the contrast between their private rhythm and the bustling expectations of society beyond their walls, a recognition that the ordinary, the unremarkable, and the consistent could hold greater significance than any social display. Conversations were rare but significant. They spoke of small observations, fleeting impressions, and minor reflections. A comment on the weather, an observation about a bird outside the window, a note about a pattern in the household, all carried the weight of attention and shared understanding. These exchanges were not dramatic, nor were they urgent, yet they built a framework of connection that was deeply reassuring. Each statement, however modest, was a piece in a larger pattern, a quiet thread weaving the fabric of their shared life. Occasional disagreements arose, minor misunderstandings over the placement of an object, the timing of a task, or the interpretation of a gesture. These moments, though fleeting, revealed the depth of attentiveness required to maintain harmony. The worker responded with calm adjustment rather than argument, acknowledging difference without resistance, and gradually guiding resolution with subtle gestures of recognition and care. Eliza observed this process with quiet approval, noting the skill and patience inherent in these unspoken negotiations. In the absence of spectacle or grand assertion, these quiet competencies shape the rhythm of daily life with a remarkable steadiness. The worker's past was occasionally glimpsed in brief references, a story of childhood deprivation, a minor illness, a fleeting memory of a distant family member. These fragments were not dramatic, not designed to elicit pity or admiration, but merely acknowledged as part of the fabric of his being. Eliza absorbed these details quietly, finding significance in the continuity and resilience evident in the accumulation of small experiences. It was a subtle reminder that history, whether personal or collective, was often composed of minor, unremarkable events whose cumulative weight shaped character and circumstance far more than any single dramatic moment. Social visitors brought faint interruptions, the polite inquiries and subtle judgments of outsiders contrasting sharply with the private reality of the household. Noble acquaintances, distant relatives, and occasional suitors arrived, often attempting to impress with displays of wealth, title, or rhetoric. Eliza observed these visits with quiet amusement, noting the discrepancy between intended impression and actual impact. The worker, as always, remained unobtrusive, attending to practical matters with discreet attention, rendering the social performances largely irrelevant. In this dynamic, Eliza appreciated the contrast between spectacle and substance, the quiet authority of consistent attentiveness overshadowing all ostentation. As months passed, patterns of domestic life solidified further. Routines became rituals, minor gestures acquired significance through repetition, and the cumulative weight of attention created an invisible structure of emotional stability. Eliza recognized the subtle emotional intelligence required to navigate this continuity, the capacity to observe, respond, and adjust with patience and care. The worker's presence, though unremarkable in conventional terms, was a persistent assurance, a soft anchor against the turbulence of societal expectation. Each day, each minor task, each quiet observation reinforced the framework of connection and mutual recognition that structured their shared life. Evenings often ended with quiet reflection, a gentle conversation about small occurrences, or silent companionship in shared activities. There was a sense of temporal continuity, a recognition that days, weeks, and months were woven together not through spectacle or dramatic events, but through repeated, reliable patterns of attentiveness. Eliza found reassurance in the predictability, the calm presence, and the subtle affirmations embedded in ordinary actions. It was a comfort that required no declaration, no public acknowledgement, only the private accumulation of care and observation. The passing of seasons added texture to the rhythm. Subtle changes in light, temperature, and daily routine were absorbed with minimal disruption. Tasks shifted slightly to accommodate new demands. Gardening moved to accommodate planting and harvest. Household chores adjusted with changes in weather, but the underlying structure of attentiveness and mutual recognition remained intact. Eliza noted the quiet adaptability inherent in this pattern, the capacity to absorb minor disruptions without loss of coherence or connection. In these observations, she found a reflection of broader principles of relational stability, patience, and subtle negotiation. Minor social expectations continued to press from beyond the household. Letters, inquiries, and occasional visits reminded her of the conventions and pressures of the wider world. Yet these were largely peripheral, their influence diluted by the lived reality of daily rhythm, attentiveness, and private engagement. The worker's unassuming presence provided continuity, mitigating the minor disruptions of social obligation and reinforcing the stability of their shared existence. Eliza's reflections often included a wry, quiet humor at the contrast between societal preoccupation with status, wealth, and title, and the profound significance of ordinary attentiveness, reliability, and subtle emotional intelligence. She moved through the kitchen with the same deliberate rhythm, attending to the teapot that hissed softly on the stove, the soft clink of porcelain accompanying the quiet morning light that crept through the narrow windows. The worker, leaning slightly against the worn wood of the counter, observed with a kind of patience that bordered on habitual. He did not speak. There was no need. Presence in their household was more eloquent than speech. Eliza arranged the teacups with meticulous care, the steam curling gently upward, almost forming a separate, delicate pattern in the air. She noted the alignment of spoons, the faint smudge of a finger that could not quite be wiped away, and she smiled quietly, more to herself than to him. It was a small victory over disorder, a subtle assertion of control in a world that had never granted her much. The worker moved then, almost imperceptibly, to adjust the small stack of firewood near the hearth. His movements were deliberate, careful, each placement considered. He did not need acknowledgement. His satisfaction lay in the completion of the task itself, the quiet fulfillment of necessity. Eliza watched, noting how easily he moved through space, attending to details that might have been overlooked by others. There was a rhythm to his work, an unspoken elegance, a consistency that contrasted sharply with the chaotic unpredictability of noble households she had glimpsed through letters and passing encounters. She remembered one distant cousin who had insisted that a servant's position could never match a lady's refinement, and she had smiled at the absurdity, recognizing that refinement was less about titles and more about constancy and attention. Breakfast was simple: bread, cheese, a little fruit, tea. The worker poured and served without ceremony, his quiet movements sufficing to maintain the routine. Eliza ate slowly, savoring both the food and the quiet that accompanied it. There were no grand proclamations of love, no declarations of wealth or ambition, only the subtle interplay of mutual recognition, a silent acknowledgement that each day was shaped not by grand gestures but by small, persistent acts of care. The tea was warm, the bread modest, yet there was a richness in the rhythm of shared routine that no title, no marriage contract, no display of wealth could replicate. After breakfast, Eliza moved to the small study, a room lined with books she had acquired over the years, some through purchase, some through the quiet generosity of a few trusted acquaintances. She ran her fingers along the spines, noting which titles had been read most recently, which had been abandoned midway, and which had been referenced in the quiet reflections of the household. The worker followed at a distance, attending to minor details, dusting a shelf, straightening a stack of papers, making small adjustments without comment. There was a subtle poetry in this arrangement, a quiet acknowledgement that attention to detail, to continuity, mattered more than performance or outward recognition. Letters arrived, occasionally, folded neatly and sealed with wax. They bore the faint imprint of distant relatives, acquaintances, and minor officials. One letter contained an invitation, couched in polite language, urging her to consider the propriety of her household arrangements. Another reminded her of a distant family obligation, emphasizing the importance of appearances and alliances. She read them carefully, noting the polite absurdities, the subtle pressures, the assumptions of entitlement. They were curious artifacts of a world that placed greater importance on status than on substance, and she smiled quietly at their insistence. The worker, glancing briefly at the letters, made no comment, acknowledging their presence only through the measured adjustments of his tasks. Afternoons were occupied with household chores, minor repairs, and gardening. The worker moved with patience and methodical precision, attending to the garden, adjusting a loose hinge, repairing a simple chair, Eliza observed, noting the ease with which he navigated each task, the absence of complaint, the quiet dedication that shaped the rhythm of their shared life. She reflected on the absurdity of courtly expectations, the frantic displays of wealth, the obsession with appearances, all of which were unnecessary in the calm, ordered microcosm of their household. There was a kind of authority in this quiet reliability, a subtle mastery of circumstance that rendered spectacle irrelevant. Visitors arrived occasionally, though never in great numbers. They brought polite greetings, subtle judgments, and minor requests. Noble acquaintances, distant relatives, minor officials, each attempted, in their way, to impress, to assert, to influence. Eliza listened with quiet amusement, noting the contrast between their self-importance and the subtle order of her household. The worker, as always, remained unobtrusive, attending to the practical, ensuring that the space maintained its calm rhythm. In this contrast, she found both reassurance and subtle humor. The world outside might insist on spectacle and status, yet here, within the quiet walls, such concerns were irrelevant. Evenings were marked by a gentle slowing of activity. Candles were lit with deliberate care, casting a soft glow across the room. Eliza might read aloud briefly from a book, though more often she allowed the words to drift around her mind silently, savoring the quiet atmosphere. The worker moved quietly, tending to minor tasks, ensuring that fires burned evenly, that utensils were in order, that the household remained calm. There was a subtle humor in their coexistence, a recognition that the simplest actions, repeated consistently, carried more significance than grand proclamations or dramatic gestures. In these evenings, she felt the accumulation of care, the quiet persistence of attention, and the steady, reassuring presence that had drawn her to him initially. Conversations were occasional, modest, and unremarkable in appearance, though laden with understated significance. A note about the weather, a fleeting observation about the garden, a comment on a passing visitor, each was noted, acknowledged, and woven into the rhythm of shared life. Disagreements arose, though rarely over the placement of an object or the interpretation of a minor gesture. These were resolved quietly, without drama, through subtle adjustments, patient attention, and a shared understanding of routine and habit. The worker's approach to minor conflict, calm, observant, steady, was a quiet lesson in negotiation, patience, and emotional intelligence that Eliza absorbed with understated approval. The worker's past, glimpsed occasionally through small references or fleeting memories, was neither celebrated nor lamented. Stories of childhood, illness, and minor deprivation appeared not as dramatic anecdotes, but as subtle markers of resilience, continuity, and lived experience. Eliza noted these fragments quietly, understanding that character was shaped less by dramatic events than by the accumulation of minor experiences, the quiet decisions of everyday life, and the persistence of presence through time. The ordinary, in their household, was both instructive and comforting, a testament to the understated power of continuity and attention. Social expectations pressed occasionally. though their impact was muted by the household's private rhythm. Letters reminded her of obligations. Visitors brought subtle pressures, and distant relatives insisted gently upon adherence to convention. Yet within the quiet household, such pressures were peripheral. The worker's presence, steady and unassuming, absorbed minor disruptions, maintained continuity, and reinforced the calm structure of shared life. Eliza reflected with a quiet, dry amusement on the contrast between the broader world's obsession with wealth, title, and spectacle, and the profound significance of consistent attention, reliability, and understated emotional competence. Seasons shifted gradually. Light, temperature, and minor routines adapted with subtle grace. Gardening shifted with planting and harvest. Household chores adjusted with weather, but the underlying rhythm remained consistent. Each day, each task, each minor gesture contributed to the continuity of life. Eliza appreciated this adaptability, the capacity to absorb change without loss of stability, and the understated strength in small, persistent acts. The worker's quiet guidance and attentiveness formed the backbone of this stability, a soft but enduring structure against the minor turbulence of circumstance. Children, apprentices, and occasional younger relatives contributed to the rhythm of the household, introducing minor interruptions and requiring gentle guidance. The worker engaged with patience, modeling calm attention and respectful interaction. Eliza observed, quietly noting the impact of consistent, understated care on behavior, cooperation, and the cultivation of a minor, everyday civility. These small lessons, though unremarkable in appearance, reinforced the broader structure of attentiveness, reliability, and emotional intelligence that defined the household. Evenings, particularly, were a time of reflection and quiet humor. Candles cast gentle light across the room, shadows dancing softly on walls, creating patterns that shifted imperceptibly with time. Eliza sometimes read aloud, sometimes allowed the words to drift silently in her mind, appreciating the rhythm and texture of language. The worker engaged in minor tasks, tidying, attending, observing with steady calm. There was an understated humor in the contrast between the household's internal reality and the broader social obsession with display, wealth, and title. The quiet accumulation of attention and care, invisible to outsiders, constituted a far more profound and enduring form of stability. The passing months and years solidified these patterns. Minor adjustments, brief discussions, small disagreements, and the ongoing attentiveness of both parties accumulated into a deep familiarity, a quiet mutual understanding, and a subtle emotional bond. Letters continued to arrive, visitors continued their polite intrusions, and seasonal tasks required adaptation, yet the fundamental rhythm remained unbroken. Eliza and the worker shared a life defined less by external recognition than by the quiet, cumulative significance of ordinary actions performed consistently, attentively, and without need for applause. The mornings followed the same gentle cadence, almost imperceptibly shifting with the seasons, the sun casting longer shadows in winter and softer light in spring. Eliza often lingered at the window, watching the pale light spread across the garden, noting the subtle changes in the soil, the budding of early shoots, and the slow, inevitable growth of plants that required neither praise nor admonishment, only consistent attention. The worker moved beside her, carrying tools or small bundles of seeds, never rushing, never speaking unnecessarily. His quiet presence was a kind of anchor, grounding the day in its measured rhythm, a gentle counterpoint to the occasional chaos that life beyond their garden occasionally pressed upon them. Some days, minor disturbances arrived in the form of letters with slightly sharper tones, insisting on social proprieties or family obligations. Eliza received them with a calm, dry amusement, reading each aloud to herself in a voice so soft it barely disturbed the silence. The worker would adjust a chair or set aside a watering can, his movements steady, deliberate, a quiet accompaniment to her musings. They both understood, without words, that the letter's importance lay not in their demands, but in the consistency with which the world outside attempted to impose expectations. Here, within the house, continuity mattered far more than social decree. Their meals were modest but deliberate affairs. Bread baked in small loaves, cheese from local farms, occasionally a bit of preserved fruit or honey, each item prepared and arranged with care. The worker served the tea with a quiet attentiveness that had become routine, his movements measured and precise as though the act itself carried weight. Eliza noted the subtleties, the slight tilt of the cup, the small adjustment of the plate, the faint steam curling above the teapot. These small, ordinary acts were, paradoxically, deeply intimate. The attention they required, the patience, the shared understanding, constituted a domestic ritual that was more binding than any spoken promise. Visitors arrived sporadically, though not in great numbers. Distant relatives, minor officials, or acquaintances, curious about the household's unusual arrangements, appeared from time to time. Their manners were carefully polite, often verging on obsequious, and their conversation tended toward trivial matters, comments on weather, observations on distant court intrigues, or subtle attempts to probe the household for scandal or advantage. Eliza listened quietly, sometimes offering faint, ironic smiles, while the worker maintained his understated vigilance, ensuring that nothing disrupted the calm rhythm of domestic life. These encounters were rarely notable, except for their contrast with the quiet constancy that defined the household's everyday reality. Afternoons were frequently spent in practical endeavors, the work of maintaining a home in a state of ongoing order. Gardening demanded attention, repair work required patience, and small domestic projects emerged unpredictably. The worker's skill in these matters was unassuming yet precise. Doors were mended, windows adjusted, minor leaks attended to, garden beds enriched and weeded. Eliza observed these activities with quiet fascination, noting the subtle interplay of skill, patience, and attention that allowed the household to function smoothly. She reflected often, with a faintly ironic smile, on the disparity between these understated competencies and the ostentatious displays of wealth and title she had encountered in the wider world. Evenings offered opportunities for more personal, quiet engagement. The worker might read aloud briefly from a small book, chosen more for its rhythm and simplicity than its intellectual challenge. Or they might sit in companionable silence, attending to minor tasks while sharing the same space. Conversation was rare but measured, often consisting of observations about the day, fleeting memories, or reflections on the minor changes in the household or garden. These moments were imbued with subtle intimacy, a recognition that emotional depth could exist without performance or flourish. Eliza's understanding of the worker's past unfolded gradually, not through dramatic revelations but via small disclosures. He spoke occasionally of childhood experiences, minor hardships, and the slow accumulation of skill and knowledge necessary to survive in a world that often valued title above competence. She noted, with a quietly ironic amusement, the contrast between his resilience and the fragile vanity she had observed in members of her own social class. There was a profound, quiet dignity in the worker's approach to life, a steady acceptance of reality tempered by consistent care for those around him. Children and young relatives, when present, added gentle disruptions to the rhythm of life. They required guidance, correction, and attention, all of which the worker provided with understated patience. Eliza observed, often silently, the subtle ways in which his quiet authority shaped behavior, encouraging minor virtues, obedience, attentiveness, and respect without recourse to drama or reprimand. These small lessons, though seemingly mundane, contributed to the household's cohesion and reflected a deeper understanding of human nature, one built on consistency, observation, and gentle influence rather than spectacle or coercion. Letters continued to arrive, their content varying from benign inquiries to polite insistence on social proprieties. Eliza read them carefully, noting the faintly absurd assumptions underlying many requests or instructions. She sometimes shared them with the worker, not to seek advice, but to acknowledge their presence and consider the implications quietly. His response was typically minimal, often consisting of subtle adjustments to the household or the environment, reinforcing the quiet structure that made daily life so manageable. There was a subtle humor in the contrast between these small, controlled responses and the exaggerated drama implied in the letters themselves. Over time, the household's routines solidified into patterns that were almost ritualistic in their regularity. Morning tea, light cleaning, gardening, small repairs, reading, occasional conversation, and evening reflection composed the fabric of daily existence. Each action, repeated with calm consistency, reinforced a sense of order and predictability, a counterweight to the external world's unpredictability and occasional absurdity. Eliza noted, often silently, the comfort derived from this predictability, the gentle satisfaction of tasks completed thoughtfully, and the steady companionship that required neither declaration nor ceremony. Seasonal changes were accommodated with minimal disruption, the household adjusting subtly to light, temperature, and weather. Windows were opened or closed, fires lit or dampened, garden beds shifted according to planting cycles, and domestic routines adapted with minor alterations. Yet the underlying rhythm remained unbroken. The workers' quiet diligence ensured that the household maintained stability, while Eliza's awareness of minor adjustments fostered a shared understanding of continuity. It was a life measured in small acts, quiet observation, and understated emotional resonance, rather than in declarations, ceremonies, or social accolades. Social expectations continued to press upon them, though their impact was muted by the household's internal rhythm. Letters insisted on proprieties, distant acquaintances offered veiled advice, and occasional visitors attempted to assert authority or influence. Within the household, these pressures were peripheral. The worker absorbed minor disruptions through steady attention, while Eliza responded with quiet discernment, allowing the household's internal order to remain intact. There was a subtle amusement in this dynamic, a recognition of the discrepancy between external urgency and the enduring significance of quiet, consistent care. Evenings remained a time of gentle reflection, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that shifted imperceptibly across walls and furniture. Eliza often lingered over minor domestic tasks, reading or simple observation of her surroundings. The worker continued his own activities with measured care, maintaining the calm order that defined their life together. Conversation was minimal, though when it occurred, it was precise, deliberate, and emotionally significant. The quiet intimacy of these moments, sustained over months and years, formed the backbone of their relationship, reinforcing a profound connection grounded in attention, reliability, and mutual respect rather than external recognition or ceremony. The years passed with subtlety, marked by minor adjustments, seasonal rhythms, and the quiet accumulation of experience. The household adapted to external pressures, internal needs, and personal growth without dramatic disruption. Eliza and the worker developed an unspoken language of care, a shared understanding of rhythm, and a mutual recognition of each other's constancy. It was a relationship defined not by spectacle but by quiet reliability, not by grand gestures but by the repeated, understated acts that sustained daily life. Occasionally, external circumstances intruded, distant relatives attempting to assert claims, minor local disputes requiring attention, or letters demanding acknowledgement. Each intrusion was met with measured response. Eliza read, assessed, and often dismissed trivialities with subtle amusement, while the worker ensured the household's physical and emotional environment remained undisturbed. Their combined approach allowed continuity to persist, the internal order of the household remaining intact despite minor disruptions or external demands. Daily tasks, though unremarkable individually, accumulated into a pattern of quiet mastery. Cleaning, gardening, repairing, organizing, attending to visitors, reading, and reflection formed a seamless flow, each action reinforcing the next, each moment building upon the subtle structure of attention and care. This continuity fostered a sense of security, familiarity, and understated intimacy that contrasted sharply with the external world's preoccupation with status, display, and ceremony. The worker's patience and steady attention became a model for minor social interactions, demonstrating the understated power of presence, observation, and thoughtful action. Eliza reflected on this quietly, recognizing that his influence extended beyond immediate household needs, shaping manners, behavior, and understanding without overt instruction or correction. The subtle accumulation of guidance, modeled through action rather than words, was a form of education both practical and moral, quietly embedding principles of responsibility, attentiveness, and emotional resilience. Time's passage was measured in subtle details: the slow darkening of candle wax, the faint creak of a floorboard, the growth of a plant from seedling to maturity, the quiet accumulation of dust in corners requiring gentle attention. Eliza noted these changes with the same quiet care she applied to letters, meals, and conversations. The worker's consistent presence ensured that minor disruptions never escalated into disorder, that the household retained its rhythm, and that the subtle intimacy of their shared life continued uninterrupted. Even small disagreements were managed with understated skill. A misplaced item, a slightly overwatered plant, or a minor misunderstanding about a task prompted quiet adjustment rather than complaint. Eliza observed the humor in these moments, appreciating the gentle rhythm of correction and adaptation. The workers' responses were always calm, measured, and consistent, modeling the principle that stability arises not from grand gestures or authority, but from attention, patience, and subtle guidance. The household's social life remained intentionally minimal. Occasional visitors arrived, letters arrived more frequently, and the external world occasionally intruded, but the household's internal rhythm absorbed these incursions. Their life together was defined by continuity, understated cooperation, and quiet attention to the ordinary rather than the dramatic. The subtle contrast between this internal order and the external obsession with status and display provided a gentle, ongoing source of ironic reflection. The morning settled into an almost imperceptible rhythm, each one blending into the next, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth from the garden, the subtle warmth of sun filtering through thin curtains, and the quiet steady presence of the worker who moved about the house as though each action were a meditation rather than a task. Eliza often lingered at the threshold of the kitchen, watching him attend to small chores, arranging plates, tending to the fire, checking the water supply with an attentiveness that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary, the kind of quiet skill that only years of careful observation and habit could cultivate. There was something soothing in his methodical approach, a soft reassurance that life, in its slow, inevitable march, could be managed, if not controlled, with patience and attention. Occasionally, distant relatives would arrive, usually under some pretense of concern or curiosity, their presence reminding Eliza of the world beyond the quiet walls of the house. They were often dressed in the latest fashions, heavy fabrics, and ostentatious jewelry, carrying with them a subtle but constant judgment, a silent measuring of wealth, pedigree, and propriety. The worker would meet them at the door, offering a polite nod or a quiet greeting, and then return to his work with measured composure, as though the intrusion were merely another element of the day's landscape rather than an event demanding energy or excitement. Eliza would watch these interactions with quiet amusement, noting the contrast between their calculated fuss and the serene ordinariness of the life she shared with him. Evenings were perhaps the most tranquil part of the day. The candlelight cast a warm, flickering glow over the simple furnishings, illuminating the lines on the worker's face that spoke of years of labor and quiet endurance. Eliza often sat nearby, spinning yarn or mending garments, her eyes occasionally lifting to observe the rhythm of his movements, the slow care with which he tended to each small duty. Conversation was sparse, yet when it occurred, it carried a kind of understated weight, each word measured, deliberate, and imbued with subtle meaning. They spoke not of grand events or ambitions, but of the gentle observations that composed their shared reality. The way sunlight touched the garden at a particular hour, the slow growth of a vine, the faint noise of birds settling in for the evening. Letters continued to arrive, each one offering a reminder of obligations that existed outside the household's carefully maintained rhythm. Some were brief inquiries, others more insistent, suggesting attendance at distant gatherings, arrangements of marriage, or the assumption of duties deemed appropriate to Eliza's station. She read each one with a gentle sigh, often aloud, allowing the words to settle into the quiet atmosphere before deciding, without drama, how to respond. The worker would sometimes pause his work to glance at the envelope or observe her expression, but rarely did he offer advice. His guidance was less in words and more in the stability he provided, the assurance that the household would continue undisturbed regardless of external insistence. As the seasons shifted, the routines adapted with gentle precision. Spring brought the first stirrings of growth in the garden, tiny shoots pushing through dark soil, accompanied by the faint, sweet smell of early blooms. Summer extended the days, bathing the rooms in warm light, making the simplest tasks, watering, pruning, arranging flowers, slightly more pleasurable, if only because the sunlight lent them a quiet aesthetic beauty. Autumn ushered in a softer palette, with leaves drifting slowly to the ground, and winter softened the landscape into muted tones, calling for the careful tending of fires, the preparation of preserved foods, and the gentle repair of weathered windows and doors. In each season, the worker adjusted his actions with the same measured care, his attentiveness serving as a quiet rhythm around which the household could organize itself. Minor domestic disasters were handled with understated competence. A broken handle, a small leak, or a mislaid tool might have caused tension in other households, but here, each incident was addressed calmly, methodically, with minimal fuss. Eliza often noted, with dry amusement, the contrast between her former acquaintances' theatrical reactions to minor inconveniences and the quiet efficacy of the worker's approach. There was a kind of elegance in his simplicity, a dignity in his refusal to dramatize, and a subtle reassurance in the way he could manage the ordinary catastrophes that life inevitably provided. Occasionally, faint echoes of gossip reached them, carried in the careful phrasing of visiting relatives or through letters that hinted at social disapproval. Eliza read these with gentle irony, the faintest smirk touching her lips as she considered the absurdity of distant observers attempting to measure virtue, propriety, or taste. The worker seemed barely to notice, his attention focused on the tangible world, repairing a chair, tending a plant, ensuring the smooth operation of daily routines. Yet even in his silence, there was an understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that the external world's judgments could be acknowledged without being internalized, allowed to exist as background noise rather than dictate the rhythm of their lives. Children, when they appeared in the household, usually distant nieces or nephews, introduced soft disruptions to the otherwise measured flow. They required supervision, instruction, and attention, which the worker provided with understated patience. Eliza observed these interactions carefully, noting the subtle ways in which his presence shaped behavior. The gentle correction, the modeled patience, the quiet insistence on attentiveness to small details. It was education without drama, discipline without spectacle, an ongoing demonstration that subtle influence and steady presence could be more effective than command or punishment. Even within the domestic sphere, minor tensions emerged, usually in the form of unspoken differences in preferences or priorities. Perhaps a room was arranged slightly differently than expected, a plant overwatered, or a meal seasoned too strongly. These moments were rare, but when they occurred, they were met with quiet negotiation, subtle adjustment, and minimal verbal exchange. The worker's approach was always calm, steady, and measured. Eliza's responses were often wry, tinged with a gentle irony. The household thrived on this understated equilibrium, a delicate balance of attentiveness and tolerance that preserved harmony without requiring overt assertion of authority. The worker's own history, when glimpsed through fleeting anecdotes, revealed a life shaped by practical necessity and quiet resilience. He spoke rarely of childhood or personal ambitions, preferring to let his actions convey competence, reliability, and emotional steadiness. Eliza, in turn, observed these traces of past experience with interest and subtle admiration. The contrast between his understated, grounded existence and the often ostentatious lives of her own social acquaintances offered endless opportunities for reflection, ironic amusement, and quiet contemplation. She noted the subtle ways in which his life had prepared him for the domestic responsibilities, the social intrusions, and the minor absurdities that characterized their shared world. Small social rituals persisted, often in the form of occasional visits from distant acquaintances or minor officials, letters from extended family, or brief interactions with neighbors. Each intrusion was accommodated with calm precision, the worker managing practical arrangements while Eliza navigated social niceties with quiet irony. The household absorbed these external pressures without altering its core rhythm, demonstrating that consistency, attentiveness, and quiet authority could counterbalance even the most persistent demands of status, expectation, or tradition. The rhythm of daily life, punctuated by minor tasks, seasonal adjustments, and infrequent social interactions, became almost meditative in its regularity. Mornings flowed into afternoons without abrupt transition, afternoons into evenings without the need for marked ceremony, evenings into nights with a gentle acknowledgement of passing time. The worker's presence, steady and unobtrusive, anchored this flow, ensuring that each action, each minor interaction, and each small decision reinforced the underlying continuity of the household. Eliza, in her reflective quiet, often found amusement and satisfaction in the subtle elegance of this routine, recognizing that stability, attention, and mutual respect were more potent than titles, wealth, or public recognition. Evenings sometimes included shared reading, though not for intellectual challenge or social pretense, but for rhythm, sound, and gentle reflection. A passage might be chosen for its cadence, the soothing repetition of phrases, or the subtle depiction of daily life that mirrored their own existence. The worker would read aloud with quiet attentiveness, or Eliza might read, pausing occasionally to note small observations or respond with understated irony. These sessions reinforced intimacy without spectacle, a mutual acknowledgement of presence, patience, and shared life that needed neither drama nor declaration. Time accumulated subtly, marked by small changes in the household, minor adjustments in routine, and the slow development of shared habits and understandings. Letters continued to arrive, visitors occasionally intruded, and distant relatives remained faintly concerned about propriety. Yet the household's internal order persisted unshaken. The worker's steadfast presence and Eliza's quiet discernment ensured that each day, each minor event, and each fleeting disruption contributed to the ongoing tapestry of domestic life rather than threatening its fragile equilibrium. The interplay of external expectations and internal stability became increasingly apparent. Social pressures, gossip, and distant claims continued to press against the calm order, but their influence was muted by the household's rhythm. Eliza noted, often with gentle irony, the contrast between external urgency and internal tranquility, recognizing that the persistent attention to ordinary tasks, the careful tending of relationships, and the consistent application of patience and care produced a far deeper sense of satisfaction and security than the outward trappings of status or wealth. The worker's quiet skill, practical wisdom, and emotional constancy formed the backbone of this enduring calm. Seasonal changes continued to influence the household subtly. The light shifting in the windows, the chill of winter air, the warmth of summer sunlight, and the slow transformations of the garden. Each adjustment required minor adaptations, fire tending, water management, clothing adjustments, and garden care, but the underlying pattern of attentiveness and shared responsibility remained unbroken. This quiet responsiveness, combined with mutual understanding, ensured that the household maintained both functional stability and emotional equilibrium, despite the often absurd pressures of the wider world. Visitors occasionally pressed for information, advice, or engagement, yet the worker maintained calm boundaries, addressing practical matters efficiently while avoiding unnecessary entanglement in social intrigue. Eliza observed these interactions with dry amusement, noting the contrast between the visitor's restless expectations and the serene, almost ritualized responses of their household. There was subtle humor in the difference between the theatrical performances demanded by society and the understated grace with which the worker preserved domestic order, and in the quiet acknowledgement that stability and competence rarely required acknowledgement or applause. Daily life continued with an almost hypnotic consistency. The passing of hours, marked by minor domestic tasks, quiet observation, and occasional understated interactions. The worker's movements, deliberate and methodical, set the pace, while Eliza's reflective awareness attended to both practical and emotional subtleties. Letters, visitors, and social pressures arrived sporadically, but each was managed with the same quiet care, reinforcing the internal rhythm of their shared existence rather than disrupting it. The resulting flow resembled a kind of gentle meditation, each day an extension of the last, a continuous unfolding of small acts that collectively defined the household's unique character and stability. Even minor disagreements, when they arose, were resolved through subtle negotiation, small adjustments, and minimal verbalization. A misplaced item, a slightly altered schedule, or a minor difference of preference prompted reflection rather than argument. The workers' responses were calm, consistent, and patient, modeling the principle that order and harmony were preserved not through authority or dominance, but through steady attention, gentle correction, and understated influence. Eliza, with her dry humor, often noted the contrast between these small resolutions and the dramatic disputes she had observed elsewhere in her social circles, appreciating the quiet efficacy of this approach. Even as the months slipped into years, the subtle rhythm of the household remained unchanged. The worker continued his quiet attentiveness, moving through the rooms with the same careful deliberation that had first drawn Eliza's notice. He carried no grand ambitions, no desire for wealth or social recognition, yet somehow he commanded a presence that reassured her, a certainty that, despite the vagaries of fortune and the persistent pressures of distant relatives, life here could continue at its own pace. Eliza, for her part, maintained a gentle balance between amusement and affection, often observing the small quirks of his habits, the way he sharpened knives with a precision bordering on obsession, the ritualized brushing of the floor that became almost hypnotic, the soft humming of tunes he seemed to invent as he worked. Letters still arrived occasionally, some from family members, others from acquaintances who assumed that her choices should be subject to evaluation or commentary. She read them with quiet irony, noticing the faint absurdity of the language, the insistence on propriety, the subtle indignation that she had chosen someone beneath her station. The worker rarely reacted to these intrusions. His calm was as immutable as stone, yet occasionally she would glance at him, noting the tiny twitch of his lips that suggested he had overheard enough to understand the context. He never spoke of it, which only reinforced the quiet strength of his character. Winter brought with it long, muted nights, and the household adapted to these with gentle care. Candles were arranged with meticulous precision to maximize light. Fires were tended with constant attention, and meals were prepared with a simplicity that emphasized sustenance and comfort rather than display. On particularly cold evenings, they would sit together in the main room, Eliza often spinning yarn or folding linens, while the worker moved quietly about, attending to small chores. Occasionally, the faintest of jokes would pass between them, delivered with a dry tone, almost as if they were acknowledging the absurdity of social expectations without allowing them to intrude into their peace. Neighbors, when they ventured close enough to take notice of the household, often commented on the calm that seemed to radiate from within. Some assumed it was a sign of wealth or social cleverness. Others whispered that it must conceal some secret, a hidden turmoil that was carefully managed behind closed doors. In truth, there was no secret, no elaborate concealment. The worker's life had been simple, shaped by the modest realities of labor and observation, and Eliza's choices reflected a quiet intelligence, an understanding that fulfillment often arose not from title or fortune, but from stability, respect, and understated companionship. Spring eventually returned, and with it the familiar stirrings of life in the garden. Eliza observed the first blooms with quiet fascination, noting the subtle changes in light, the gentle shift in temperature, and the delicate resilience of the plants. The worker moved among them with the same care he applied to all aspects of daily life, pruning, watering, and arranging with precise attention. Occasionally, he would glance at her, his expression unreadable yet reassuring, and she would smile softly, realizing that their partnership was a dialogue in silence as much as it was in words. Each season seemed to affirm the strength of their quiet bond, demonstrating that the ordinary, when attended to with care, could be profoundly sustaining. Visitors continued to arrive, some with curiosity, others with faint disapproval. Each was met with the same calm courtesy. The workers' measured responses, combined with Eliza's dry, understated humor, deflected any attempts at social grandstanding. They hosted with neither flourish nor pretension, creating an environment that simultaneously accommodated their guests and preserved the essential rhythm of the household. Letters from distant family members still demanded attention, but they were treated as minor interruptions rather than threats, their persistent demands gently absorbed into the larger flow of domestic life. Children, when present, became small sources of gentle disruption. Nieces and nephews sometimes stayed for weeks at a time, introducing laughter, mess, and the occasional minor argument. The worker's patience was infinite, and Eliza's observations of his interactions with the children were tinged with quiet amusement. He managed disputes with gentle authority, teaching patience and attentiveness without raising his voice. The household adapted, absorbing their energy and chaos without losing its core rhythm, demonstrating that calm consistency could balance even the unpredictable vitality of youth. Over the years, small domestic disasters continued to occur. A dropped plate, a leaking roof, or an accidental spill became opportunities for understated competence rather than drama. Each was addressed with careful efficiency, repairs, adjustments, and corrections carried out with a steady hand and quiet thoughtfulness. Eliza often remarked, in her dry humor, on how different this approach was from the frantic, theatrical responses she had witnessed in other households. The workers' calm focus not only restored order but subtly reinforced the household's underlying sense of security, demonstrating that routine, attentiveness, and patience were forms of quiet power. Evenings remained a slow, meditative succession of ordinary actions. Meals were simple, fires were tended, and small domestic tasks filled the gaps between moments of reflection. Occasionally, a book was read aloud, chosen not for prestige or intellectual display, but for rhythm, cadence, and gentle amusement. Conversations, when they arose, were deliberate, measured, and quietly ironic. Never rushed, never urgent. The worker's voice carried a subtle steadiness that, paired with Eliza's dry observations, created a rhythm both comforting and strangely hypnotic, a lullaby woven from ordinary words and ordinary tasks. Through all of this, their bond deepened without ceremony or dramatic acknowledgement. It was built on observation, subtle understanding, and shared attention to detail. Eliza noted the reliability of his presence, the quiet skill with which he managed both the household and the occasional intrusion from the wider world. In turn, the worker observed her nuances, the gentle ways in which she managed expectations, negotiated minor disagreements, and maintained calm in the face of social absurdities. Neither required ostentation, neither demanded declarations. Their companionship thrived in the spaces between words, in the ordinary acts of care, and in the quiet acknowledgement that life's small rhythms could be more sustaining than the grand gestures that so often occupied the social imagination. Years passed almost imperceptibly. The garden matured, the furniture wore into gentle familiarity, and minor marks of age began to appear in the walls, floors, and fabric of the household. The worker's hair gradually darkened with streaks of gray, and Eliza noticed subtle changes in her own reflection. But these were observed with the same calm attention that marked all other aspects of life. Each imperfection, each subtle shift, became another element in the tapestry of quiet continuity that defined their shared existence. Occasionally, rumors reached them faint, distant whispers about the choices Eliza had made. Some implied folly, others assumed scandal, yet these held no power over the household's rhythm. The worker, as always, remained serene, addressing only the practical implications if necessary, while Eliza acknowledged the absurdity with understated irony. They had created a world in which external judgment could exist only as a distant echo, incapable of intruding upon the carefully maintained order, stability, and quiet satisfaction of their daily lives. Time moved slowly, the household adapting with gentle attentiveness to the minor changes that came with age. Windows required repair, floors demanded polishing, and small household arrangements were altered to accommodate evolving needs. Each action was executed with care, precision, and the unspoken understanding that small attentions preserved not just function but a shared sense of peace and continuity. The worker's presence remained the anchor, while Eliza's dry humor and quiet intelligence reinforced the subtle bonds of companionship, mutual understanding, and enduring patience that defined their world. They spent long mornings in the garden during spring, observing the first buds and noting the slow emergence of life after winter's dormancy. Summer afternoons were filled with deliberate, measured activities, tending the plants, repairing tools, and attending to minor chores, all executed with attention and a quiet sense of purpose. Autumn's soft decay was acknowledged in careful cleaning, preparation for colder months, and reflection on the passage of time. Winter nights, long and muted, were filled with spinning, sewing, reading, and quiet conversation. Each season was absorbed not with grand celebration, but with a deliberate, meditative awareness that the ordinary, when treated with care and consistency, could produce its own deep satisfaction. Even the rare moments of tension, misplaced objects, slight misunderstandings, or minor disagreements were handled with subtle negotiation, patience, and reflection. The worker's calm steadiness never wavered, and Eliza's dry, reflective humor softened potential friction. Together, they navigated these small incidents with an understated grace, reinforcing the household's overarching rhythm and demonstrating that stability, attentiveness, and mutual respect were more potent than wealth, status, or public approval. Through decades of quiet life, they became accustomed to each other's subtle rhythms and habits, achieving a state of tacit understanding that required few words. The worker anticipated her needs with unobtrusive attentiveness, and Eliza recognized his small efforts with gentle appreciation. Their companionship, built on ordinary tasks, shared observation, and consistent attention, grew into a profound, unspoken intimacy. It was a relationship that required no performance, no spectacle, and no validation from the outside world. Its strength lay in the quiet constancy of everyday life, the shared understanding that care, attention, and patience could sustain more deeply than any outwardly visible gesture of affection or status. Even as old age settled into the household, bringing the slow decline of strength, the subtle ache of joints, and the quiet accumulation of memories, their lives retained the same calm rhythm. The worker moved more slowly, his tasks executed with the same care but with added deliberation, while Eliza adapted her own actions to accommodate his pace. Their interactions remained deliberate and understated, marked by dry humor, gentle observation, and the steady rhythm that had defined their shared existence for decades. The household continued to function as a small, self contained world of attentiveness, reflection, and quiet companionship, largely unaffected by the outside world and its persistent, often absurd demands. Even in their final years, the worker's presence provided an unspoken reassurance, and Eliza's awareness of their shared history lent a subtle gravity to ordinary actions. Tasks that might have seemed minor, a folded cloth, a repaired window latch, a prepared meal, were imbued with meaning by the constancy of care and the mutual understanding that framed their existence. Each day, while quiet and ordinary in outward appearance, carried the weight of accumulated experience, subtle observation, and shared effort. Their lives had become a gentle meditation on the value of consistency, attentiveness, and companionship, demonstrating that fulfillment could emerge from small acts repeated over time rather than grand gestures or public acclaim. And when, eventually, the rhythm of life slowed to its natural conclusion, it did so without drama, spectacle, or pronounced declaration. The household, carefully maintained for decades, bore witness to the quiet constancy of their lives. Tasks were performed with calm diligence until no longer possible. Letters remained unread but acknowledged, and the garden continued to grow with gentle persistence. Their bond, forged through ordinary acts, shared observation, and understated understanding, endured to the very end, leaving a subtle yet profound testament to a life lived quietly, deliberately, and with attentive care. It was neither the wealth of the household, nor the distant judgment of relatives, nor the pressures of social expectation that defined the significance of their years together. It was the daily practice of attentiveness, the gentle acknowledgement of each other's presence, and the patient cultivation of ordinary routines that rendered life meaningful. In this unassuming constancy, they found a stability, a sense of intimacy, and a quiet satisfaction far beyond the reach of titles, grandeur, or spectacle. Their story, though outwardly uneventful, carried the weight of enduring patience, shared effort, and the subtle triumph of ordinary, sustained companionship. In the end, the life they had built, slow, deliberate, and quietly humorous, served as its own gentle testament. Each task, each gesture, each quiet glance or understated joke carried significance not because of grandeur, but because of continuity, attentiveness, and mutual care. Their days, measured and ordinary, became a form of quiet triumph over the unpredictability of fortune, the absurdity of social expectation, and the inevitable passage of time. And in this unbroken rhythm of shared existence, the true value of their companionship, forged through decades of attentive observation, subtle humor, and gentle presence, became finally, quietly, undeniably apparent, leaving behind the legacy not of spectacle, but of enduring calm, modest contentment, and the subtle, profound intimacy of lives fully lived together.